Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. On behalf of the organizers and co-sponsors of this event, FIMI, Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, IFGIA, the Permanent Mission of Denmark, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, I warmly welcome all of you to this side event on ending violence against Indigenous women. I would also like to take this opportunity to express our deep appreciation and great thanks to all our speakers here today. My name is Lola Garcia-Lix, and I'm the Senior Advisor on Global Governance in the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs, IFGIA, and I have the honor to be the moderator of this event. But before starting the event, I will remind all participants about some of the housekeeping rules that have been shown before. That participants can write questions in the chat, and there will be a Q&A section in the program. So if you have questions, please write it in the chat. You can also use the chat to introduce yourself if you wish. Please remember to mute the microphones in order to keep a good sound of the interventions. And the webinar is live streamed into Facebook and recorded. So going directly, as we do not have much time, to the topic of our side event, discrimination and violence against Indigenous women and girls is prevalent. This has been repeatedly documented and stressed by UN mechanisms and bodies such as the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the CEDAW, as well as regional human rights institutions such as the Inter-American Commission. In the chat, we will put the links to all these reports that have been produced by UN procedures and mechanisms, and also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights report on the rights of Indigenous women in the Americas. Discrimination on the basis of gender and race is also a cause of the violence faced by Indigenous women and girls, and a cause of the impunity and complacency with which this violence is treated by public officials. This is widely documented. It is widely documented that Indigenous women and girls experience diverse forms of violence in disproportionate amounts as compared to other women and girls. This includes a higher exposition to various forms of sexual violence, trafficking, and domestic violence. Violence against Indigenous women also occur in particular and very different contexts, such as during armed conflicts and militarization of their territories, during the implementation of development, investment, and extractive projects, and while exercising the defense of their human rights and the human rights as women, but also of their communities. Therefore, the objectives of this event was first of all to highlight the severe situation of violence and repression that Indigenous women face. Some have called it a pandemic. The other objective, of course, is to bring the voices of Indigenous women as driving actors and leaders in and outside of their communities. In the context of the current consideration of this topic at the MRIP session, the MRIP session will consider the topic of violence against women, Indigenous women, this afternoon, and also at the 50th session of the Human Rights Council. The Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, which we have today with us, presented her thematic report on violence against Indigenous women some weeks ago to the Human Rights Council. We would like also to look into actions, to examine actions and measures that must be taken to prevent violence against Indigenous women and protect Indigenous women from violence. And also, we think it's important that we use the event to look into possible ways to strengthen the role of the Human Rights Council, its subsidiary bodies, as the special procedures or the MRIP, on issues related to violence against Indigenous women. So I won't say much more because we have very good speakers with us today that will talk much more about those issues and will share their experiences and their views and their recommendations. So with this word, I will give the floor to Mr. Lars Volk Madsen, who is the Minister Consular Deputy Permanent Representative at the Permanent Mission of Denmark at the United Nations in Geneva. So Lars, welcome, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lola. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
Someone nods. Yes, nodding is there. We're still, even though we've tried it so many times, one is still uncertain whether it all works out. Thank you very much, Lola. Thank you to IFGIA for holding this event. We're very proud to be co-sponsors of it, as we are hopefully many times also in the future. We are very proud of our cooperation with IFGIA, which to my mind remains an outstanding partner on these issues. So as for the topic today, it is so obviously pertinent. Indigenous women and girls face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, as we know, and they also form very serious forms of violence. Violence against Indigenous women and girls is examined thoroughly in the most recent report of the Special Rapporteur to the Council. And as it's stated in the report, Indigenous women and girls face larger risks of many types of serious violation, including sexual and gender-based violation. And they also face individual as well as collective violence, making the matter even more complex. And the report underscores this very important aspect, that it comes from many actors, from non-state actors, private companies, armed groups, members of their own communities, and of course, very often from the state that they live in. And IFGIA's latest report provides statistics on violence against Indigenous women in a number of states, and it is a chilling read. In addition, violence against Indigenous women and girls is often drastically underreported, which is the other very important aspect to keep in mind, that even those chilling numbers are still underreported numbers. So it's clear from the reports of the Special Rapporteur, IFGIA's sources, that the problem is extremely relevant and of concern to all Indigenous peoples and to all states. And it is, and with so many other human rights issues, one where we, as the Kingdom of Denmark, also has to look inwards. The government of Denmark and Greenland are working closely together to disclose details of testimonials recently brought forward about involuntary sterilization programs taking place in Greenland from 1960 to 1970. And an official independent investigation into the historical events is necessary as a first step in order to properly address that wrongdoing. So we're looking forward, therefore, to this event, to hear the comments on it, and get wiser. We all have to, and at least we're in a position ourselves where we want to learn from all of you. So over to you, Lola, and thank you once again for making this event happen.
Thank you very much, Lars. I think you have set very well the stage of our event. And We are very honored to have the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women with us today, and we will hear more about the report later in the event. And Lars, I think it's really important. I think you mentioned also Denmark, Greenland own issues with regard to, if you can call it, is also a violence, forced sterilization. It's a violence against women, and how these issues can be tackled based on a dialogue, an understanding, and a recognition of the wrongs done in previously. So this is, as you said, the first step, and I really think it's very important as a government, and in the UN they like to talk about best practices, and the first step for a best practice is to recognize the wrongs that has been done against Indigenous peoples, and in this case against Indigenous women. Thank you very much, Lars. So we will go directly to the second part of the main part also of our event, which are the voices from Indigenous women from the ground. And we think it's important. There are many other Indigenous women attending the MRIP session. And this afternoon, as I mentioned, the MRIP will consider the violence against Indigenous women. It will be a lot of statements. And I will recommend all the participants in this meeting to watch the discussion on this very important item. And you will find the UN TV link in the chat for those who are interested to following the discussion at the MRIP this afternoon. But I have the enormous pleasure to present Ms. Praya Rai. She's an Indigenous woman from the Right community in Nepal. She has been working to advance women's human rights for more than 13 years. And currently she is with the Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, one of the organizers of this event, heading the Indigenous Women's Program. She also strongly supports the network of Indigenous women in Asia as a steering committee member. So Pragya, very welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. I have two questions that I will also ask the other Indigenous women speakers to respond. And I would like you, if you could share with us some key messages that you have about Indigenous women in Asia struggle against violence. And I think just to give a kind of a overall picture, in many ways, we don't have much time to go into that. And I know the topic gives for speaking about it for many hours. But and the second question is more related to action, because as an Indigenous women activist and from your own experience, we would like to hear what actions do you think are needed to effectively combat violence against Indigenous women in Asia. So Pragya, over to you.
Thank you, Lola. First of all, Sewa, that's my Indigenous greetings to everyone present today. And thank you, Lola, for this wonderful introduction. Today, I represent Network of Indigenous Women in Asia, NIWA, and it is an honor to speak on behalf of our sisters from the 14 countries of Asia. To answer your first question, Lola, as you already said, this requires hours and hours. But violence against Indigenous women in Asia is not limited only to gender-based discrimination, but largely contributed by ongoing colonization, militarization, racism, social exclusion, and poverty-inducing economic and development policies. For example, militarization is high in indigenous territories of Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh, the Mindanao, the Lumad regions of the Philippines, northeast states of India and Myanmar, contributing to violence and torture of Indigenous women and girls with impunity, forceful evictions, internal displacement, and the need to seek refuge. While forced displacement and the burden on Indigenous women as food providers has been noted previously, of particular grave concerns are incidents of sexual slavery. Most recent examples we have noted in Myanmar, where teenage girls were routinely conscripted and taken to army bases for purposes of sexual slavery. Climate change has created newer risks for Indigenous women and girls from climate-related shocks, such as exposure to labor rights violations and violence after migrating to urban or other areas. In our report submitted to the Special Rapporteur, we have contended that the intersection of the climate crisis, development aggression, militarization of Indigenous communities exacerbate the prevailing violence experienced by Indigenous women and girls. Climate change is forcing Indigenous women to search for new ways to manage natural resources for their food supply and livestock, which is increasing their time poverty. Many Indigenous men out-migrate in search of work, which exacerbates women's burden of work in the community. Consequently, women's participation in community activities remain limited, which reduces their role in decision-making and thus increases their vulnerability to GBV. This was studied and reported in the countries of Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam. These circumstances corroborate the fact that Indigenous women and girls in Asia continue to be left behind. However, there is strong commitment and desire from Indigenous women's networks and organizations to come together and advance for the individual and collective rights of our Indigenous sisters in the Asia region. We are working together and progressing by raising voices, widening spaces, and building collective strategies for all Indigenous women and girls across Asia. We would also like to thank the Special Rapporteur for putting together a comprehensive report on the violence against Indigenous women recently. Madam, you can count on our continuing support and full cooperation to your work in advancing the rights and well-being of women in general and Indigenous women and girls in particular. For the actions that that are needed to combat violence against women from Network of Indigenous Women in Asia, we would like to recommend for the international partners, international processes and mechanisms to increase support to Indigenous women's issues, like that of Special Rapporteur's UN reports, CEDAW's recent general recommendations draft on Indigenous women and girls, and this year's MRIP's priorities on violence against Indigenous women. Resources shall be allocated and increased to strengthen Indigenous women's work in grassroots. States need to stop criminalization of Indigenous lifestyles, food systems, and culture. Instead, recognize Indigenous women's contribution to climate change mitigation and adaptation as acknowledged in the Paris Agreement. States must stop violating and manipulating the rights of Indigenous women and girls in the name of development, political process, or emergency measures, and ensure proper implementation of the CEDAW for the protection of Indigenous women and girls against violence and for their economic and political empowerment. Lastly, on behalf of all the Indigenous women and on behalf of Network of Indigenous Women in Asia, I would like to say that Indigenous women united will never be defeated. Thank you, Lola.
Lola, you are muted. You could unmute.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Priya, for your short but concise and comprehensive presentation, where you have really addressed the questions that I have to do and really touch upon all the issues and all the enormous challenges that Indigenous women face in Asia. I think the issue of impunity, forced evictions, militarization, as you mentioned, sexual slavery, but the issue of the links between climate change and climate action and Indigenous women's rights. I think it's very important to take it into consideration. And to end with a positive remark, I think you mentioned that Indigenous women are fighting together. They are together. They show their resilience together, and they are not victims. They are agents of change. So thank you very much, Priya, for your presentation. And I will now give the floor to Ms. Cynthia Marcela Ellis from Belize. She's a Garifuna woman. She served as the ambassador for the Garifuna Nation, a network of Garifuna peoples around the world working to build sovereignty and land rights for the Garifuna people. Cynthia, as with Priya, I would like you to respond to these two questions about the key messages about the struggle of the Garifuna women against violence. And also, if you could share with us the same as Priya, some kind of what action do you think, from your perspective, your experience, from the Garifuna women's perspective, what actions are needed? So Cynthia, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is a privilege and an honor to be in this sacred space this morning. And I want to give thanks to my ancestors and all those who came before me, and just acknowledge the men and the women, Indigenous men and women, who gave their lives to this struggle and this movement, which began long before the United Nations had this conversation. As a Garifuna woman, I would like to give thanks to UNESCO that declared in 2003 the Garifuna people as a gift to humanity, a masterpiece culture, because we were considered a people who, in spite of genocide and annihilation in our history, we still maintain our sense of self and identity. I want to give thanks to the organizers of this gathering, because for many of us who live in our countries, Garifuna expands around the world. When we speak of Garifuna Nation, we are aligned with men, women, and children who are connected indigeneity all over the world, the Caribbean, South America, Central America, and the United States. Wherever we are, we consider ourselves a sovereign nation and people. And so our way of being is very different from the other way. We were here before Columbus landed on our shores. The power of Garifuna is we are considered a bridge. Through our veins runs the indigenous and the African roots. And we are not just speaking about Africa, the continent, but those of us who were transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, in this bridge in the United States, I actually consider the African American or the Africans in America indigenous as well. So we align with the struggles of the men and the women over the years who shed their blood, their sweat, and their tears. So we're thankful that in this conversation about violence, we need to present that historical fact and the trauma of that experience and how we are going to break the cycle. So many of the things that the sister just shared, I'm not going to repeat them, but I'm going to highlight the similarity. We are a people who, yes, I'm based in Belize, but indigenous way of being has no boundaries nor borders. One of the things that we have found as women who are struggling for affirmation, for acknowledgement, for value, for honor, is that we are not recognized or acknowledged sincerely or authentically even in the US systems. We had a delegation going to the Indigenous Peoples Forum in New York. It was extremely difficult to get into that forum. Imagine the contradiction, an Indigenous Peoples Forum, but we had to jump hoops because of the mechanisms that the United Nations has in having us participate in a meeting or a gathering which is about us. So that is a major concern that we have. We have a concern that we are not included in these processes of conversation at the national and the international level in a more meaningful way. Because for one thing, we are not understanding or aligning with the systems of the United Nations in terms of who we are and our sense of self and our sense of identity. However, moving forward, people need people, and we do appreciate the facilitation of this forum to present our issues which are critical. We all know them in the documents and so on. Many of our people, Garifuna people, focus on fighting for our land. And for that is a major contradiction. And even though we align ourselves as Garifuna, we connect ourselves with the struggles of indigenous people throughout the world. Because what has happened is that the Maya in Belize, who were the original people in Belize, we have almost 2,000 Maya temples in our country, which have been desecrated according to our way of being, where there are researchers who come and take our artifacts and bring them to other parts of the world, including the United States, Canada, and Europe. And many of these are not what are called African artifacts, are sacred expressions of who we are. We are also very concerned and aligned with the Maya land rights movement, where the Maya have taken the government, our government, to court. And so the Garifuna, we are aligning with that in terms of affirmation of our sovereignty as a nation within nation states. We were here first. We have been slaughtered in many countries of Central America, such as Honduras and Guatemala. I am sure that you are aware of Rigoberta Menchú, who tirelessly fights for the rights, not just of women and children, but for all indigenous people. So whilst we are focusing on the concerns of women, we are also focusing on all our children and our families. On this path, of course, climate change, health and wellness concerns, land issues, economic empowerment, what the United Nations declares as sustainable development has been our way of life from time immemorial. We need to be affirmed and acknowledged that the knowledge and the practices that we have are the ones on which the world needs to be grounded. We respect and we honor the earth. We are not destroying it. The whole issue of climate change emerges from the destruction and the disrespect of the earth. And we as women represent the beauty and the sacredness of the earth. So as elders, one of our movement is to look towards the generations to come, 7 generations to come, that we will prepare and to take back and to reclaim what has been destroyed. The multinational corporations have no regard for us and our governments align with these multinational corporations. We have a specific situation in St. Vite, Belize, where a corporation is building an entity beside our sacred temple, what we call the Dabuyeba in Garifuna. We align with the Maroons around the Caribbean and the world, and the indigenous Taino, the Arawaks, the Native Americans in the United States, Canada. We align with them because this is not a unilateral strike. So even though I come here as a Garifuna woman, concerned about those who have been slaughtered, those in Central America who are rushing to cross the United States border to pursue what they perceive as the American dream. My heart pauses a little bit at the recent news of people who were found dead in a truck crossing the border of Mexico to seek what they perceive as freedom and economic empowerment. I want to close by saying that for us, we are peace-loving people. We ally with the African American Harriet Tubman, who went through the Underground Railroad seeking freedom for people from enslavement to cross the Canadian border, and she could have saved many more. So as a Garifuna woman, activist, and struggler, I just want to give thanks for this opportunity. And what we would like to see in terms of action is honor and respect and consultation to be at the table where we could authentically give our concerns, not just to ask for what we can receive, but what we can offer. We have a lot to offer in terms of the wealth untold in our forests, in our waters, in our seas. We are the ones who have the knowledge about the indigenous plants and their uses. And those information, as before, have been stolen. Let's call it what it is. The information has been taken to other countries and given back to us in another package. That has to be broken. That cycle of economic and intellectual property rights oppression needs to be broken. We must not be called people who are poor or underdeveloped. What a contradiction when we are the ones who have been the ones with the knowledge and the practice which has been taken. So I want to thank you once again for this privilege and for this honor. And that my one take-home message here is support us in understanding these mechanisms so we can learn how to navigate them, because it is very overwhelming and overwhelming. And let's be honest and sincere about that. Support us in honoring, giving homage to the places where our people have been genocided. For example, the Garifuna were taken as prisoners of war to Europe. Our leadership, men and women, were tricked and trapped into believing that there was integrity in the conversation, in the authenticity. Help us to repatriate our artifacts, as they are called, back to our countries where they belong. I thank you. Thanks be to you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for this powerful statement, those powerful messages of sovereignty. First of all, sovereignty as people, sovereignty as indigenous peoples. So really powerful statements. I was really sorry to hear the problems that you have faced to participate in the permanent forum and some of the international forum, because I think it's very important. It's very important to bring the voices. You end by saying the right to participate in decision making. I think it's crucial to ensure that for all indigenous peoples. And of course, your remarks at the very end, the contribution of indigenous peoples, I think not only victims, they are victims of a lot of human rights abuses that you have also presented, but also the resilience and the contribution that they have to a better world. Thank you very much, Cynthia. So our third speakers, and I'm very pleased to present Ms. Jane Naini Meriwas, who is the Executive Director of Samburu Women's Trust in Kenya. She's an indigenous woman, a mother, a feminist, a women human rights defenders, community development practitioner for more than 20 years, advancing women's and girls' rights among indigenous communities. At policy level also, governance and humanitarian response in Kenya and beyond. Jane, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. So over to you. As I said, what are some of the key messages that you can share with us regarding violence against women in Kenya, in Africa? And also, what kind of actions do you think could be put in place? I think there are many actions at national level, at international level. Brian and Cynthia has also mentioned something, but some of your reflections, I think they are similar, of course, but I think the context are different, but the problem is very similar. So please, over to you, Jane.
Thank you so much, Lola, my longtime friend, our friend from IGEA, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, my other indigenous sisters, and the participants who are listening to us. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and as well as also bringing the key discussion at the center of indigenous women, especially when you're discussing around issues on gender-based violence, which it's intertwined. Either you are in America, you are in Africa, gender-based violence is the same. It's only depend with the context. Now, when I speak around issues on gender-based violence, coming from Africa, being an indigenous woman, and actually particularly in Kenya, one of the things that women are facing currently is that there's been a very severe drought, coupled with a lot of conflicts in most of the areas that indigenous communities are in Kenya. And this one put more threats both to the livelihood of generally the indigenous people, but worse to the women and girls, because you find there's a lot of migrations from rural to urban migration, because a lot of people have lost their livestock, then people are very vulnerable. Then there's also a lot of conflict within at the homestead level, which also trigger a lot of gender-based violence within the family level, because there's no food and maybe the woman is demanding for food. There's also a lot of divorce that we are witnessing, something we've never seen among indigenous communities. There's also an influx of young people moving from the rural to the urban. This one also put a lot of identity into risk. And even a lot of young girls who are dropping out of schools. As a result, when the families lose their livestock, their parents tend to trade them for more animals. So the level of girls accessing school is actually decreasing and increasing young teenage pregnancy. In a community which infrastructure around issues on the environment, it is very scary. So, and then also the other also challenges being posed by this conflict and drought. You find when people still in the conflict between the pastoralists and the conservancies, who are mostly the ranchers, you find there's a lot of militarization already in these territories. And once there is military, more combined of paramilitary, government doing operations, the people who suffer are women and girls. There's a lot of silent rape. And in a community which you come from, sometimes women don't disclose because of the norms that if I'm raped, I'm going to be subjected to be divorced. And there's a lot of silent rape, there's a lot of evictions, people are subjected to all sorts of human rights violations. But you find it's difficult because one, Indigenous women, majority of them have no capacity to read and write. They cannot even report these issues to the police station because these are the same people who are supposed to protect them, that they have violated their right. So one of the key messages, I believe, is that if really Indigenous women can participate and be included in terms when they're developing policy, our inclusion, our participation, our involvement and consultation is key so that our issues are become the center of conversation. And it is ourselves who say, this is what we want. Then the policy should be friendly, it should not be the other round. The other thing also, I think currently in Kenya, we are preparing in the next 30 days for election. So I also believe that also politics also inform decision-making. And if women do not access to this leadership position where policy are developed, especially Indigenous women, then we'll be left behind. Then how do we also make sure that Indigenous women who are participating in politics, in decision-making, that they are according, protection, especially areas where it is very violent, areas which is around issues, people have guns and women cannot even do, free politics. They cannot look for votes, and communities where discussions are made at night, and it is the men who make decisions, and women are excluded because you have a family, you have a husband, you have a child to attend to. So basically, these are some of the things that we're seeing that as much as we want us to participate effectively, how do we also make sure that policy becomes the center of discussion? The other issue also, key messages also, is around issues on governance structures, particularly to the community I come from. Most of the governance structures are not friendly to women. These are governance structures which elders make informed decision. They make decision, it is them who sit in these bodies, and these bodies are final, just like the parliament in Kenya. They decide who is going to run, who is going to be elected. So they don't have spaces for women. How do we also make sure that women become the center of conversation in terms of decision making? The other things also, if you really want women to give account, what is happening? Strengthen their skills, their knowledge, in terms of accessing resources, in terms of them knowing how do we engage to SWIDO, how do we engage the UN mechanism? How do we report? How do we give account of the issues which is happening in the ground? These are also some of the gaps that we are seeing, that strengthening Indigenous women on how to document, report in some of these mechanisms, as well as participate. Now, in terms of actions, one of the actions that I think personally should be done is the one I've just said is one, support Indigenous women to understand and to navigate around these issues on mechanism. What is happening at the national level, regional, and international level? The other one is that strengthen also referral mechanism, so that if something happened to Indigenous women, they're able to know, how do I report to? How do I access justice? Because this one also we give free to perpetrators. And this one also frustrates, especially the victims, more Indigenous women, if you don't access justice. So how do we also make sure that we strengthen referral mechanisms so that Indigenous women can access justice? And more so is making sure that whenever there is a discussion, whenever there is development of policy, whenever there is any conversation, Indigenous women should be the center of discussion, and they should be the one to say, this is what we want, this is not what we want. The same thing also should also happen to government. Government, state agencies, when they develop policy, when they have issues around issues of Indigenous people, they should not be discussed on their behalf. They should be brought on the table so that their issues are taken care of and they know these are the issues we want to discuss. The same issues with also with the funders, international community, they should make a center and conversation live for Indigenous women. It doesn't matter, even if they don't understand the language, they just make sure that the language Indigenous women discuss are the ones should be factored in. And lastly, making sure that you've increased resources for Indigenous women to access most of this discussion we are talking about, if it is lobbying at the national level, participating at the regional level, and making sure spaces of international platform that they have access, because once we don't have resources, it also denies Indigenous women an opportunity to make freely, make a decision and make sure some of these issues are catered for. I think most of other things that my sisters from IPP and my other sister have raised, and I think gender-based violence is across. It only depends on the areas that all of us are coming in. And to me, our solidarities, one collective voice as Indigenous women, either in Africa, Asia, across Africa, should be key, so that we are also strategizing ourselves. How do we push our agenda as Indigenous women, both making sure that developing key recommendation at the CEDAW, developing key recommendation at the African Commission, or even international level, they are standard, so that there is no loophole. The government will say, these are not standard recommendation. And thank you so much for giving us the opportunity. And I hope that we'll continue further even after this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jane. I have taken a lot of notes, but you said it much better than I can say. I think you raised a lot of issues that also the previous speakers has brought up, but and we can see the similarities. I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, I think the main objective of this event is provide you with a platform to build your collective voice. But the whole issue of access to education, how important it is for Indigenous women and girls, the whole issue of conservation and militarization as a driver of a lot of the violence against Indigenous women, access to justice, participation and inclusion, the need of the Indigenous women empowerment, the need to strengthen the skills on documenting their situation, and of course the actions, the need to increase considerably the support to Indigenous women's organization networks, Indigenous women initiatives at the local level, in order to strengthen their capacity to seek access to justice and end impunity against the violence that they suffer. Thank you very much, Jane. Our next speaker is Ms. Nadia Fenley. She's the research officer and impact issues at the International Indigenous Forum, FIMI. Nadia, welcome. And we very much appreciate you join us here today. And as with the other speakers, based on your experience as a researcher or leading research, you have produced a lot of research about the situation of Indigenous women. What are some of the key messages? Of course, perhaps you are the last Indigenous women speaker, so a lot perhaps have been already said, but I think we need different perspectives. So I would like you to share with us some key messages about Indigenous women's struggle against violence in Latin America or globally, if you prefer. So, and of course, look into possible actions. Thank you very much. Nadia, over to you.
Gracias, Lola. Un saludo a todos los panelistas, a las hermanas que me antecedieron. Súper importante todo lo que he escuchado. Para quienes están escuchando por primera vez de FIMI, FIMI, el Foro Internacional de Mujeres Indígenas, es un mecanismo global que articula procesos de organizaciones de mujeres indígenas para fortalecer capacidades, hacer incidencia y formación y capacitación. FIMI empezó a trabajar el tema de violencia contra mujeres indígenas desde el año 2007 Y nuestro punto de partida fue cuando el entonces secretario general de la ONU lanzó un informe sobre la situación de violencia contra las mujeres en general, ¿verdad? Pero en este informe no abordaba las especificidades de las mujeres indígenas en cuanto al tema. Y a partir de entonces, FIMI inició un proceso de trabajo de investigación, se lanzó el Mayri Niwan Carraya, en donde aborda las distintas manifestaciones o la forma en que las mujeres indígenas viven la violencia. A partir de eso hemos venido trabajando en todo un proceso de aproximación conceptual a qué es la violencia para las mujeres indígenas. Hemos venido trabajando en la categorización de algunas manifestaciones, ¿verdad? Y como dije, trabajando en un acercamiento conceptual. A partir de esto y escuchando lo que las hermanas han dicho, un mensaje que puedo destacar aquí o resaltar es que las mujeres indígenas estamos luchando contra la violencia en dos niveles, dentro y fuera de nuestras comunidades. Dentro de las comunidades, enfrentándonos a normas, creencias, instituciones de la vida tradicional comunitaria que muchas veces que van estructurando las relaciones de género entre hombre y mujer, ¿verdad? Y muchas veces estas normas, estas prácticas atentan contra la salud, genera violencia contra las mujeres, ¿verdad? Y de fuera de sus comunidades se enfrentan a racismo, a la discriminación, a programas políticas que no toman en cuenta las particularidades de las mujeres indígenas. A partir de eso, otro mensaje sería que para abordar de manera efectiva la violencia contra las mujeres indígenas no debe perderse de vista el enfoque de los derechos humanos individuales y colectivos. Para FIMI ha sido fundamental, ha sido uno de los principios que ha guiado nuestro trabajo sobre el tema. Es decir, no podemos pensar en estrategias de violencia sin tomar en cuenta al colectivo. No podemos pensar en estrategias de acción tomando en cuenta solo al grupo de mujeres como un grupo separado dentro de la comunidad. Debe abordarse de manera colectiva, tomando en cuenta a los líderes tradicionales, a las autoridades, a los guías espirituales, de manera que se fortalezca el principio de la complementariedad en esto. Otro mensaje que hemos venido posicionando desde FIMI a lo largo de estos años es que pues, la violencia contra las mujeres indígenas no puede verse solo desde el ámbito familiar. Como ya dije, FIMI ha venido trabajando en la categorización de otras manifestaciones. Y se ha logrado posicionar esto como la violencia ecológica, la violencia ambiental, la violencia espiritual. Y un tercer mensaje es que se debe de tomar en cuenta los saberes y conocimientos de las mujeres indígenas, dar voz propia a ellas para demostrar que no estamos solamente en un papel de victimización, en una situación de victimización, sino que estamos aportando y somos portadora de grandes procesos dentro de las comunidades a nivel familiar, individual, pero a la vez a nivel nacional e internacional. Somos el soporte de procesos que va desde lo local a lo internacional. En este proceso de trabajo de FIMI pudiéramos destacar como una estrategia de acción o como una opción efectiva para luchar contra la violencia, el tema de conocer nuestros derechos, fortalecer nuestras capacidades. Y en esa línea FIMI ha estado promoviendo e impulsando la Escuela Global de Liderazgo que acaba de terminar su 9ª edición, en las que han participado hermanas indígenas de distintos pueblos de las distintas regiones. La recolección de evidencia y la generación de materiales de conocimiento consideramos que es una estrategia que aporta a la lucha, al proceso de lucha contra la violencia. Hablamos de la generación de materiales de conocimiento, que son estudios, pero realizados por las propias mujeres indígenas, a través de metodologías propias de las comunidades, que por un lado nos permitan que estos materiales nos sirvan para revalorizar los conocimientos tradicionales, pero por otro lado que permita a las organizaciones de mujeres indígenas tener información sistematizada sobre la situación que enfrentan, la situación de violencia que enfrentan. Coinvertir en iniciativas propias de mujeres indígenas es una estrategia también efectiva. Iniciativas orientadas al emprendimiento y la autonomía económica. Y hablamos de una autonomía económica en responsabilidad con el medio ambiente. Fortalecer y apoyar las prácticas de sanación espiritual. Y fortalecer la alianza, promover alianzas, el fortalecimiento organizativo. Hoy por hoy hay muchos sistemas de organización propia de mujeres indígenas que están trabajando, están construyendo, articulando agendas. Existen experiencias exitosas de alianzas entre movimiento indígena y movimiento no indígena que ha podido fortalecer el trabajo entre ambos. Entonces, estas algunas estrategias que pensamos que son fundamental en este proceso de lucha contra la violencia desde FIMI. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Nadia. Te lo agradezco. Creo que es muy importante considerar el tipo de acciones, recomendaciones y basados en la experiencia de vuestras propias estrategias que has compartido aquí con nosotros hoy. Creo que has mencionado aspectos muy importantes, cómo se abordan los problemas de manera colectiva, fortalecer la complementariedad, no verlo como un silo aparte, la lucha de las mujeres indígenas, la importancia de los saberes y los conocimientos de las mujeres indígenas, la aportación de las mujeres indígenas que ya las otras compañeras han mencionado, el tema del conocimiento de los derechos, el conocimiento por parte de las mujeres indígenas de sus derechos como mujer, como pueblos indígenas, es muy importante y creo que se debe enfatizar la necesidad de apoyo. El ejemplo de la escuela de liderazgo de FIMI es una práctica muy importante de aprendizaje. Y en la cuestión del apoyo que ya se ha mencionado, la necesidad de apoyo que también se han mencionado las otras compañeras, el tema de invertir en iniciativas para asegurar la autonomía económica de las mujeres indígenas, la importancia de las alianzas. Todo esto me parece que complementa muy bien lo que las otras panelistas han presentado. Muchísimas gracias, Nadia, por compartirlo hoy con nosotros. Con esto quiero dar la palabra. I changed to English now. With this, I want to give the floor to Ms. Rim Al-Salem, who was appointed United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its Causes and Consequences in July 2021 by the UN Human Rights Council. Since starting her 3-year tenure in August 2021, Ms. Al-Salem has identified the issue of the violence against Indigenous women and girls as one of her priorities. And the issue is the subject of a thematic report that she presented to the Human Rights Council just a couple of weeks ago. Mr. Al-Salem, in your thematic report, you highlight several causes, manifestations, and consequences of gender-based violence against Indigenous women and girls, and describe also good practices and challenges with regard to their access to justice, that it has been mentioned a lot here, to truth and redress, and to support services and their participation in initiatives and processes related to the prevention of and the protection from gender-based violence. Your report includes a set of very important recommendations to states, the Commission on the Status of Women, and other relevant stakeholders. Based on the presentations that we have heard today, and based on your report that touch upon most of the issues and all the issues that our panelists have presented here to us today, could you share with us some of the key findings of your report, and particularly highlight some of the key recommendations, and of course also some of the actions that are required to ensure their implementation? And in this context, I want to express also IFGIA's support and appreciation of your report, and our commitment to make it a document that is alive. It's not a document to put in a drawer of the governments or whoever it is and forget it. So how do we, together with the Indigenous Women's Networks organizations and the support organizations, how do we make your report alive, that it has a power, and that Indigenous women also can take it in their hands? Please, Ms. Arlem, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lola, and thank you also to IFGIA, the Permanent Missions of Denmark and Finland, for the invite to participate in this event. I'm actually very delighted to be also in the presence of so many distinguished panelists and women Indigenous leaders. Perhaps if you allow me just a couple of words as to the reason why I decided to dedicate my first thematic report to this issue. So for me, the issue of violence against Indigenous women and girls is really one of the most emblematic manifestations of violence experienced by women and girls on intersectional grounds, yet where the causes and consequences of this violence are rarely unpacked, are rarely spotlighted, and are rarely understood in the mainstream discourse and discussions. Which is actually ironic when you think about it, since it actually leads to the invisibility of the experiences of Indigenous women and girls. And at the same time, and as we've heard from so many other speakers, Indigenous women and girls experience violence in very specific ways. And one of the striking ways in which they experience this violence is that around sexual and reproductive health rights, as Lars from the Permanent Mission of Denmark pointed to, and how that resulted in violence, not just for the individual woman and girl, her body, her psychological well-being, her family, but also how it was used as a tool of coercion, control, extermination, and destruction, not only of Indigenous communities and peoples as people, but also of their identity and ways of life. The other area that is very specific in terms of gendered experience of violence for Indigenous women and girls is, of course, the scale of the spiritual and cultural violence and harm they experience. I've been asked why I have, for example, used the term spiritual violence in my report. Well, for Indigenous people, including women and girls, this is a very important and concrete form of violence they have experienced. They have named it, including in today's side event. And if we are claiming that we are really adopting an intersectional approach, then that requires also an understanding and mirroring and naming of that form of violence. And Cynthia spoke very passionately, for example, about the impact of the stealing of cultural artifacts and how the non-repatriation of these artifacts continue to contribute to this sense of violence and loss that they've experienced. We've heard obviously about the causes and consequences of the structural violence that they've experienced, historic, systematic, entrenched in patriarchal power structures, racism, exclusion, and marginalization, maintained by the legacy of colonialization, a legacy that's effect continues pretty much into today. And many of my fellow speakers have spoken to that. And also have spoken to how there is a strong intergenerational component and impact of this violence. So it's really inherited from generation to another. We've also heard how situations of armed conflict related to land, territory, natural resources impact the dynamics and realities of the violence, which I've also reflected in my report, and how that also intersects with the climate crisis and environmental degradation, activities of extractive industries, and Praya spoke to that also at length. I also will be touching more on this nexus between violence against Indigenous women and girls and climate change in my upcoming report to the General Assembly in October. So stay tuned for that. Now, the report draws also attention to the fact that Indigenous women and girls with intersecting identities and characteristics some of them are also more likely to face higher rates of gender-based violence. I name a few, such as, for example, Indigenous women and girls with disabilities, or those with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. Now, it also makes a number of recommendations, and one of them is to recognize that the collective rights of Indigenous peoples and their individual rights, when approached in a human rights-based manner, they actually are mutually reinforcing. And the violations of collective rights have resulted in the violations of individual rights and vice versa. So we need to do more work to ensure that through the enjoyment of collective rights, the individual rights of Indigenous women and girls to a life free from violence is also respected, which is also a point that Nadia spoke to. So gender justice cannot be an issue that's at the periphery or that is regarded as something disruptive to the notion of collective rights. And here it should be mentioned that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People actually balances the right between individual and collective human rights and states explicitly that it applies to male and female Indigenous individuals. So I agree with Nadia that the complementarities between collective rights and individual rights should be leveraged. Also, we will have to unpack the way in which the different jurisdictions interact with each other to either exacerbate or reduce the protection of Indigenous peoples, including women and girls. So this whole interplay between the jurisdiction of the state, but also the jurisdiction of the authorities of Indigenous people. There's obviously a big problem of rampant impunity that a number of also other speakers spoke to for violence that is committed. And here, what is worth highlighting is that in addition to the established human rights principles and treaties, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples speaks about the obligation of both states and Indigenous nations to ensure that Indigenous women and children enjoy the full protection guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. Moreover, the report makes recommendations to really ensure the full and effective participation of Indigenous women and girls in all processes that have an impact on their life. And in the interactive dialogue I had at the Human Rights Council following the presentation of my report, a number of speakers actually acknowledged that there was a need to improve the engagement and participation of Indigenous women and girls in processes that are important to them. And I was asked repeatedly, how should they do that? And I think actually that there's a wealth of recommendations that have already been made, including by Indigenous people's leaders and women leaders. So the issue now was actually to have the political will to implement these recommendations. Including when it comes to ensuring the right of Indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. Also, something as simple as participation is obviously not possible if we do not address the barriers to participation, and which is really very important and fundamental in order to also have access to referral mechanism, to justice mechanisms. So how do we lower the barriers to participation? And as Cynthia mentioned, participation in a UN meeting dedicated to Indigenous peoples was something that was very difficult. And I'm very aware, for example, that in terms of input to my report, I received no information from a number of regions in the world, which points really to the barrier as in terms of knowledge, in terms of accessibility, and in terms of participation. I also want to highlight very much the issue of reparations and satisfaction. It is important for states to acknowledge truth, responsibilities, and fault, or for the systematic violence and violations that they have committed, as Lola also mentioned. And of course, some governments have taken the important, courageous step to look into the past, such as Canada. Many countries are yet to do so, but what the report is saying that even when reparations and transitional justice processes have happened, Indigenous women and girls are still very much often excluded from these. There's also a need to ensure that non-state actors, including businesses whose activities often contribute to the violence that is happening, adhere to human rights standards, and that they are held accountable. So here it's clear that the voluntary United Nations guiding principles on human rights in business, while welcome, are not sufficient. So we need really a mandatory way for businesses to be held accountable, and for states also whose nationality these businesses carry or in whose territory they work, also to be accountable for the work of these businesses. And finally, I also feel there is a need to bring together all the processes for discussing the enjoyment of rights by Indigenous peoples, including of women and girls together, and to really increase or leverage the synergies and harmony between them. So there's a number of bodies and platforms and processes that discuss these issues. They have to be better brought in sync together and to work in a more complementary manner. And this is something I have tried to do when I decided to launch the report this year, because I was very well aware that CEDAW was also furnishing its general recommendations. So it's an attempt also to basically piggyback on this momentum and also to enhance the complementarity. I hope that the welcome but belated realization of many stakeholders around the world that Indigenous peoples, including women and girls, actually contribute to protecting the world's biodiversity, and that they hold knowledge and wisdom that is environmentally friendly, will provide this an additional impetus we need to walk the talk when it comes to protecting them and ensuring their rights. And this is perhaps just one of the rare times when Indigenous women and girls are not presented only as victims, as Nadia mentioned, but also as stakeholders and as agents of change. The issue now that this depiction and this realization should actually go to all other areas of life. I apologize for having taken a long time. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Reem, for your important presentation, as I said, for the important report. That is a tool, I think it's a very important tool for Indigenous women to fight for their rights. The importance of having this kind of tools, the international community, the UN, a special procedure focusing on that, and having these recommendations, this assessment, I think it gives the whole legitimacy to Indigenous women's struggle. So thank you very much. And I don't want to use the time because I want to give the floor if some of the Indigenous panelists, they have any remark or any question to Ms. Reem Al-Salem. I would like to ask you to be brief. We don't have much time left, but I think we think it's to promote a kind of a dialogue also. I think all of you should be able, if you have any comment or any remark, to use this opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I would like to.
Okay.
Like to.
But Cynthia, please be brief, very concrete.
Very brief. It's very brief. I just want to encourage the mechanisms of the UN to facilitate us in navigating the process and what opportunities are there. And that's based on my experience in being able to navigate, is because there are women in the United Nations and connected to the United Nations who reached out to us in our countries and helped us in becoming aware of how to navigate the systems. I just want to know what possibilities are there in that respect, because that's very critical in moving forward.
Please, Rim.
Cynthia, you're absolutely right. There's more that needs to be done. Off the top of my head, I would say if you are aware of very sort of concrete ways in which we can make that happen, facilitate the navigation. Is it, for example, a language issue? Is it, do we need to have more, I don't know, online and written sort of standard operating procedures or referrals mechanisms available to Indigenous peoples and including women. So if you share that, then we can also take it up. But you're very right. I find, for example, that when it comes to translation into different languages, we still have a very big gap in the special procedures. We don't even translate everything we produce into, the 6 languages of the UN. So I can imagine when it comes to outreach to Indigenous peoples in languages they understand, that's even more difficult.
Yeah, I can be very specific because, and my proposal is that the nurturing of young women and children and girls in the conversation immediately. And UNICEF has a model for that, where they have children and young people involved in what they call child-friendly municipalities. They're actually involved in the process. The other thing is that as a young woman, I was facilitated a lot by organizations through the UN. UN is overwhelming, to understand how it works, how it functions, how to navigate through the resources. There were internships, there were visits to our countries where there were conversations and feedback within the communities. So that those are concrete suggestions that I have in terms of the outreach, so that the articulation can go beyond the walls of those buildings, which can be very intimidating for some of us.
Absolutely. Even for those at the inside of the system, it's hard to understand it often. And we still need to do a lot more to involve young women and girls in general in all our processes. That's something where there's a huge gap.
Thank you very much. Is there any further question or remark from any of the panelists? Okay, so I think we will have a little bit of time later on. I think the open round of questions and answers, I think we will move it a little bit, and even I think we will ask the people who has written any question in the chat, please address it to the panelists, and we will make sure that that you will receive a response to your question. But due to the limitation of time, I will give the floor now to Ms. Anne-Marie Froberg, which is the team leader of the UN Human Rights Council Political Department in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. Anne-Marie, it's a great pleasure and an honor also to have you with us, and give some kind of concluding remarks. I have seen that Tarsila Rivera has joined us, and perhaps I will ask her also to say some concluding remarks. But by now, I think Finland is a member of the Human Rights Council since January this year, and you have been a strong supporter of Indigenous people's rights in the working of the Council. And I would like you to share some reflections about what can be done to advance actions in the Human Rights Council aimed at ending violence against Indigenous women. Please, Anne-Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lola, and really it's a pleasure to join you, and for Finland it's of course an honor to support this event, and for me personally it's been really a pleasure to listen to the very thoughtful contributions by previous distinguished speakers. Before going into what the Human Rights Council can do and what we can do, I just want to express that women's and girls' rights and indigenous people's rights are, of course, top priorities for Finland and also in the Human Rights Council. And for us, it's very important that indigenous women and girls in all their diversity can enjoy fully their human rights. Unfortunately, as we also heard today, this is not yet the situation. There's still a long way to go in achieving this fundamental goal. Indigenous women and girls face complex and intersectional forms of violence and discrimination. I want to take us a bit step back in time to 2014, when the World Conference actually made, in my mind, a very important call to the Human Rights Council to address violence against indigenous women and girls. And especially since then, I think we have seen some important steps by the Council and its independent mechanisms on taking up this issue. In 2016, thanks to the initiative of Canada, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on ending violence against women with a specific focus on indigenous women. And we've seen in the recent years some encouraging steps also to include indigenous peoples and indigenous women in some of the resolutions of the Council, not specifically focused on indigenous peoples. So we should build on this definitely. And it's of course very important that the Council now follows up on the recommendations by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. The report was very welcome and the recommendations as well. And of course, we need to engage now in the discussions also in MRIP, and the Council should take into account the views taken up there. Turning then to what in concrete terms the Council can and should do, and these are reflections that many of the previous speakers already actually brought up, but I repeat a bit. We of course support that the Council continues its strong human rights-based work on eliminating violence against women and girls. So let's build on the resolution specifically focused on indigenous women, but also other resolutions presented afterwards. And it must recognize that violence can take many forms and of course take into account the diversity of women and girls, and continuously speak up for victims' access to justice and of course support to them based on their differing needs. We have different barriers. Women and girls have different barriers. Finland would also like to see a stronger recognition and action by the Council for the fulfillment of sexual and reproductive health and rights. As was already expressed, this is intrinsically linked to eliminating violence against women and of course to ensure the full enjoyment of rights. And then we should take strong action and support for the resolute efforts led by Mexico and others that the Council is speaking up against and takes full leadership on ending discrimination against women and girls. We have important negotiations and decisions taken this week at the Council session. Thirdly, let's have strong political call for the full, effective and meaningful participation of indigenous women and girls at all levels of society. Their voices must be heard. I completely agree with previous speakers. Policy decisions affecting them should not be made without them. And here the Human Rights Council can and should lead by example and pave way for indigenous people's participation in decision-making affecting them. And we will have the opportunity in the years to come to address this issue. And then last but not least, it's very important to contribute to the promotion and protection of indigenous people's rights altogether, to promote UNDRIP, because we and recognize that that some of the violence is really linked to also the non-recognition of indigenous people's rights. The Council, the Human Rights Council, must show support to brave indigenous women human rights defenders who many times risk their safety in defending their rights or other persons' rights or their community's rights. And for us, Finland will work for that. The Human Rights Council is a safe place for indigenous women and girls and others who take a stand at the council. So I think this is also important to keep in mind. And we will work together with all stakeholders to ensure that this ambition level would be high at the Human Rights Council, but also at other UN human rights fora, as the Special Rapporteur also referred to. And for us, it will be continuously important to also listen to the recommendations by the independent mechanisms of the Council, and of course, indigenous peoples themselves and civil society organizations, and engage with all stakeholders to ensure that we enhance rights. And I really want to thank all the speakers. There have been very important contributions and viewpoints also today that we can then take on board when we continue our work in the Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Thank you very much for your Finland's strong support to the indigenous women's cause and indigenous peoples in general. They are interrelated, as we have heard from all the speakers here. And I think we have a unique opportunity now. After many years, there are many mechanisms and UN bodies dealing with the issue of indigenous women's rights, violence against indigenous women, and it should not be left there. So how do we bring it together? How do we move forward together? I'm sure you will get the support as a member of the Council of Indigenous Women behind you, indigenous peoples behind you, and the other friendly, what is called friendly governments towards indigenous people's rights in order to promote action. You mentioned already some actions from the Council, but how do we bring it down to the country level? How your decisions are really mean something for indigenous women in the ground. And for that, we are many stakeholders that could support your work, support the special procedures, mandates to make it known among indigenous women. I think that is very, very important, because some of these reports are so important that we need to have an effort, all of us, to bring it to indigenous women, to they know about it, so they can, because if not, they become reports in a vacuum. So much more, I think, has to be done together with Indigenous Women's Network. They are the key actors to bring all these issues and your decisions back to the country level, mainly to put also a lot of pressure on national governments to take action. The words that they are mentioned at the international level, they have to be put on action at the national and the local level. So with these words, I just want to thank all participants in this event, and of course, all our panelists. It has been an honor to have you with us today. And I hope that this is not the beginning, but this discussion can continue, and to continue bringing it up at the Council, at the mechanism, continue to be high in the agenda of the Human Rights Council and of the relevant UN mechanisms. Thank you very much to all for joining us today. We very much appreciate your support. And thank you very much also to the interpreters that has given us the possibility to talk together. So thank you very much to all of us and to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.